Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. So for this week's discussion, I chose to talk about A Further Liberty in 1776, which is chapter 1 of Black Puritan, Black Republican, The Life and Thought of Lemuel Haynes, written by John Sallant. Now for those of you who did not read this article, Sallant goes on to first talk about the early life of Lemuel Haynes, noting his Christian name and the connection that he had early on from birth to religion, and how this really foreshadowed his involvement in the abolition movement and the use of scripture that he would be using for most of his arguments. He did have a spiritual upbringing, so being indentured to the Rose family, they were a Christian family, one of which was a deacon in the family. So he was receiving this Christian education from a young age, but he was also laboring throughout this early period in his life, which is important to denote because the discussion of surrogate children oftentimes kind of denotes this positive attribute associated with early indentured servitude, as further exemplified by many articles written like this one that pretty much look over that early life in that youth that was filled with labor. It was very labor intensive to the point where many, like Haynes, almost lost out on that education. So it's just important to note, and an important idea that Sallant brought up in his article. But Sallant also goes on to talk about many of the abolitionist ideas and arguments that Sallant and others would use throughout the period, starting out with talking through the American Revolution. He goes on to say that Black men and women could no more have expected to remain slaves, Hayne reasoned, that than Americans could have been expected to remain subordinate to the arbitrary and oppressive English crown and parliament. So just noting how these revolutionary ideas at the time could coincide with the ideas of many of the abolitionists working at the same time as well. So just using those to further support their arguments. He goes on to talk about the use of scripture as well. Scripture became a huge benefactor in the success of Haynes, as well as many other followers of the New Calvinist ideals at the time, who were using scripture both from the Old Testament and the New Testament, specifically noting the involvement too of Israelites and Muslims and non-Christian entities they deemed, and their involvement in the slave trade, the early slave trade, as well as the continued enslavement of African Americans and the indentured periods of servants in the colonial period, expanding throughout its use. But just noting the scripture and how the allowance in the Old Testament was later forsaken by the New Testament, and it was deemed unworthy and unreasonable, and just continuing to support this idea that the slave trade and the enslavement of individuals really needed to be put to a stop. But further noting that, and the rest of the chapter goes on to kind of hint at the idea of republicanism as well. Now, republicanism, while noted here, wasn't mentioned as much as it was in a later article written by John Sallant, entitled Lemuel Haynes, Black Republicanism and the American Republican Tradition, where he goes on to further discuss how Lemuel Haynes used these Republican ideals such as social activism and selflessness that would really contribute to the Christian ideas that they were using for most of their arguments throughout the period. Another argument that coincides with the work of Sallant is the work of Daniel Mandel, entitled A Natural and Unalienable Right, New England Revolutionary Petitions and African American Identity. So this article really coincides with the use of petitions and sermons like Prince Hall, for example, or Lemuel Haynes as well, and notes how these petitions and these sermons and their use of these throughout the abolition period really contributed to their success and a developed identity. So that is something that's really unique to this specific article because it does further that idea and talk about this construction of a new identity for Native Americans, both collective and individual, throughout the period. Thank you so much.